Today's video is about creating rigorous and reliable online exams. I'm Dr. Amanda Meyer and I'm an anatomist at UWA, and I have an interest in psychometrics when I'm looking at exams. So this talk today is about things that we can do to create a more rigorous and reliable exam. So we're going to discuss the question content in relations to constructive alignment, how to blueprint your questions to make sure that you're getting the right coverage of topics in your course, the types of questions that are available to use, the question design, so the level that you're pitching your questions at, the format that you deliver them in, and also how you construct them. I'm then going to talk about question analysis. So why do we give exams to students? Well, we know that assessment drives learner behaviour, and we know that the quickest way, or the easiest way to get students to study something is to give them an assessment on it. We also use exams to help us determine final grades that show that students have achieved a level of competency in the knowledge in your unit. We also use them to identify weak spots. So we can see if students score very low on a certain topic, that perhaps the student's learning or perhaps our delivery has been inadequate in that section, and we can go back and actually make new resources to supplement that or completely change the way that we approach delivering that type of topic. What should we be examining? Well, we should be examining content that matches the learning objectives that we've actually started out with. So that is constructive alignment, and I'll talk about that in detail a little bit later. We want to make sure that we are asking questions that are important so that they are based on the core content that we have delivered and not trivial facts. Trivial facts are nice to know for quiz nights, but are they essential to pass on that knowledge to the next cohort, or to the next, carry that in with you to your next unit? And also, you've got to think about the number of questions that you're giving on each particular topic. So you really should be making a number of questions that reflect the weighting of the importance that you've either given the topic or the number of curricular sessions that you have given to that topic. So what is constructive alignment? So constructive alignment is a term that has been used for many years, and I really like this definition by Biggs in 2014, saying that constructive alignment is an outcomes-based approach to teaching in which the learning outcomes that the students are intended to achieve are defined before the teaching takes place. Teaching and assessment methods are then designed to best achieve those outcomes and then to assess the standard at which they have been achieved. How do we do that? So here we have a image showing what constructive alignment looks like. So it's where we have intended learning outcomes, assessment, and teaching and learning activities all impacting on each other. So the intended learning outcomes are what learners will know and be able to do as a result of their experience. The assessment is going to be looking at how the learners have demonstrated that they have achieved those learning outcomes. And the teaching and learning activities are designed to make sure that students meet those intended learning outcomes and can have or perform well in their assessment. So a way of constructively aligning our exams is to do something called question blueprinting. And blueprinting is where we make a matrix or a chart that reports the number and type of questions that we're going to have for each topic in our test, and it's going to be consistent with the learning objectives of your course and also the relative weight that you have given to those topics in your course. So the more times you mention something, or the more part of your curriculum dedicated to something, the more questions you should have on that in your test. And it's good because this blueprinting provides a skeleton for academics to actually construct the examination. It makes it easier to sit down and start writing an exam if you have a blueprint mapped out with exactly how many questions you need to write for each topic. Recent papers have also shown that if you provide that blueprint to the students, so showing them the topics and the number of questions that they're going to get, they actually feel that the exams are more fair. Okay, so here's an example on the right-hand side of my blueprint for one of the exams I've written. So down on the left side here, I've written all of the topics that were covered in the lectures, and then the number of questions that are in each of those topics. Now, you might notice that the first 10 have less questions asked, and that's because I've already examined these students on this topic in their mid-semester exam. So this is a blueprint of their final exam, and the questions that are more heavily weighted, or there's a greater number of questions, are dedicated to those topics that were covered after the mid-semester exam. So I listed the topics first, and then I counted the number of hours that we spent in lectures and labs and tutorials to then work out the weighting of each of these topics. And then I made the number of questions determined to that weighting, and then I used the specific learning objectives to actually write the questions. So what type of questions types can you actually have? So here I've got a table that I've made looking at the difference between the question types that are offered in Blackboard Management Learning System versus ExamSoft. So you can see that there are numerous options in the Blackboard Learning Management System and only 5 options in ExamSoft. And I've made a note down the bottom that in Blackboard, the one that's called jumbled sentence actually means sentence with a drop-down list. So the naming of that is quite deceptive. Okay, so automatic marking. So this is something that is important if you have little time or little budget to be able to afford additional markers. So if you have automatic marking, that means it's going to reduce the time and also reduce cost. So on the Blackboard and ExamSoft, I've marked which question types enable automatic marking, and you can see that there are many options that can be used for automatic marking, and there are a few options that don't. So when you are deciding what type of question format you're going to use, you really need to have a look at your learning objective. And a learning objective from my course that I've just finished teaching is to demonstrate the ability to identify neuroanatomical structures on clinical imaging. So I have to constructively align that when I was generating the exams, and to do that I had to think about what type of learning activities I had given to the students to achieve this objective. And for that I knew that we had MRIs up in the lab, up on the light boxes, and I knew that we'd spent quite an amount of time actually looking at clinical images and pointing out various structures. And the next thing I had to think about was what type of question will actually allow the students to best demonstrate that they have achieved that objective. If I had a picture here, this would be the best way to examine if they could identify a structure on an image. An essay asking them to demonstrate the ability to identify neuroanatomical structures on clinical imaging would not be appropriate. But options like a hotspot activity where they are asked to maybe click on the corpus callosum or the mammillary bodies is completely appropriate. We can also use multiple choice. I could put a line in here going to one of these structures and I could list various numbers of structures, and they could determine if it was one of these kind of 4 or 5 structures. So there are multiple ways that you can use different types of questions to meet the objective that you need. And also what's good to note is that both of those options that are good for this are also automatically marked. Another thing to consider is the format of your question will affect the difficulty and the results. So this is an example where earlier this year I ran two different types of tests on exactly the same content. And here we can see that this test, where we've got the grades distribution up the top here, we can see that students didn't score particularly well on this exam. It was a formative exam and the mean was 39%. So there are 20 questions in this particular exam. 172 students completed it. The average score was 39%. And for those 20 questions, the average time to complete them was 18 minutes. With Blackboard, we get this automatic discrimination and difficulty index, which I'll talk about later. And it was telling us that this exam had 18 good questions and 2 fair questions, and that the difficulty had 12 medium questions and 8 hard questions. So what was this exam actually looking at? So this exam was getting students to actually click on images, on hotspot images, to find particular neuroanatomical features. They also had to click on things that provided a different type of structure or a different type of function. So there was different levels of knowledge also picked up in this exam. We can see that I've calculated the average discrimination and difficulty indexes, and they are quite good, but the overall performance was poor. And reflecting on that, that was because this was done during the COVID crisis. So when this exam had been administered, students actually hadn't been in the labs for 2 months. So they were finding it more difficult to actually identify structures on clinical images and on cadaveric brains because they hadn't had recent opportunities to do that. So this question here, or this exam here, it was looking at a drop-down answer. So this was given in the same week on the same topic, and you can see that the grades distribution is very different. We have a more normal looking curve here, and the mean score was 61%. So we were testing exactly the same content in neuroanatomy, but this time, instead of having to click on an image, they were selecting an answer from a drop-down list which had multiple answers listed. So again, they still had 20 questions built into four kind of overarching questions. 180 students completed it, and the average score was 61%. Students were able to complete this in a little bit shorter time than the hotspot activity. So this was completed in 15 minutes. The overall discrimination was all good questions, and they were all of medium difficulty. And we can see that the discrimination index is higher, and so is and the difficulty index is higher, which means it was an easier exam. So it was a more discriminating, but also a more or generally easier for the students to do. And this was because this was the type of assessment that they had been used to. So I'd been giving them bi-weekly drop-down answer questions for most of the semester. So the bottom line is that the type of exam questions you use will affect the discrimination index, the difficulty index, and also the results that your students give you. So you need to consider what you've actually done during your course. Think about the learning activities that you have given to the students and best match the type of question format with what will bring out the student's ability. And also consider the amount of practice or formative exams that you've actually given to the students in that format. Now, question levels. So when we are thinking about writing questions, there is various different levels that we can actually pitch the questions at. And most educators will be very well aware of Bloom's taxonomy, where we have our pyramid with our remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating, going all the way up to the top of our pyramid. And we know that a majority of our questions for our first year students would be remembering or understanding type questions, and questions for our third year students would be more applying or analysing. So as the level of knowledge increases, so does the difficulty of the level of the questions that we're asking. So what are some general guidelines that are going to help us write a good question for our students? So make sure that your questions include all the relevant facts, but don't contain any superfluous information, and don't add extra information going into your options. Make sure they are not tricky or overly complex. You want them to understand the question that you're asking so they can answer it to the best of their ability. Make sure that your questions can be answered without looking at the options. So an example of that is asking something like a question that I've asked before: the rubrospinal tract originates in which nucleus? So this is a neuroanatomy example. So if you know something about the rubrospinal tract and where it originates, you can answer this without going and looking at the answer options. So answer it and then look at the answer options and choose your answer. You need to focus on important concepts rather than trivial facts. An example of one that focuses on something that's interesting but trivial would be an example: which extrapyramidal tract is more active in cats than humans? And the answer to that would also be the rubrospinal tract. Make sure you don't negatively phrase your questions. These are particularly tricky for students and take them a long time to understand them, and also can lead to incorrect answering. So some examples of negatively phrased questions are: which of the following statements regarding the rubrospinal tract are incorrect? Or all of the following are true of the rubrospinal tract except... So avoid these types of questions. So make sure your answers that you've written to your questions are grammatically consistent, that they are the same length, and that they are logically compatible. An example of a poor question, which contains queuing and different answer options and lengths and some illogical answers, is below. So this question is asking, again using the same example, the rubrospinal tract originates in which nucleus? So even from looking at the name, rubrospinal, many people know that rubro means red. So we've already got some kind of cueing just from the terms that we have used in here. Now, if we look at our answer options, red is also a very different length to all the other options, so it draws our eye towards it. So we have a cueing effect there. And also, it's the only one that has a lowercase. So perhaps something's gone on when people were writing. And some of them are just illogical. So the rubrospinal tract is a motor tract, and it can't possibly have anything to do with a hypothalamic nucleus. So a favourite resource of mine that I've used for many years is Susan Case and David Swanson's book that's called Constructive, or Constructing Written Test Questions for the Basic and Clinical Sciences, and they have very generously made a copy available to download from ResearchGate. So if you scan the QR code on the right hand side there, you'll get a copy of the 181-page document. Okay, so once we have actually given our exam, it's then our chance to look at the questions and analyze them and reflect on the exam. So we firstly want to look at the distribution of results. We want to look at the reliability coefficient. We want to examine the discrimination and difficulty indexes. So this chart above, or this graph above here, is showing three different distribution of grades. So we have frequency on the y-axis and we have the grades on the x-axis. And in the middle is our normal distribution, where we have our normal curve with 95% of grades falling within 2 standard deviations of the mean, and the mean, the median, and the mode are all the same value. If our data is skewed, we can either have what happens on the left here, which is a negative skewing, where our curve is shifted to the right and our mean is actually lower than our median and our mode, or we can have a positive skewing where our curves are shifted to the left and our mean is higher than our median or our mode. So if we have a skewed distribution, either negatively or positively skewed, that can tell us that the performance of our students or the exam that we have given has not really separated people out into a normal distribution. It means it's probably too hard or too easy, and we might need to adjust the difficulty of our exams. So one of the measures that we use when we're looking at an exam to see how reliable it is to do a reliability or calculate a reliability coefficient. So the reliability is actually the measure that all of the questions on your exam actually measure the same characteristic. That is, that they're measuring what you're intending to measure, so the knowledge of that particular subject. Now, if we have a question that is dichotomous, that has a yes or a no or a correct or incorrect type of answering, we can use a test called the Coulter-Richardson test. And that is going to calculate the reliability of your test. So this was based on Coulter and Richardson's article from 1937, and there's a link down the bottom of the page to take you there. Now, if we are looking at our Coulter-Richardson coefficient, we want to see it in the range between 0 and 1, but what we really want is to see it above 0.8. So if our reliability coefficient is above 0.8, that is very good. If it's above 0.9, that means it has an excellent reliability. So it's a very good and reliable exam, measuring exactly what we have intended it to. If we then go and look at the discrimination index, and the discrimination index is looking at how well a particular question is able to distinguish between students who know what they're talking about or know the answers versus those who don't. And a point by serial correlation is a common way of computing this number, and that will actually be spat out in a lot of item analysis reports. So when we look at numbers on discrimination index, we're going to see a range from -1 to 1. And what we're looking for discrimination index is a discrimination index above 0.3. So if it is above 0.3, that means it has a good discriminative ability, that it's able to actually distinguish between a high-performing student and a low-performing student. And these are the types of questions that we want to actually bank and reuse in subsequent cohorts. If it has a negative discrimination index, we need to check those before we go and have a look. So, or before we release the results. If it has a negative discrimination index, it could be because you've put the wrong answer key in. So you always need to double check that when you see that. So these are questions that you would not bank and you would not reuse in the current format. If you have some questions falling in the 0.1 to 0.3, they have a fair ability to discriminate between high and low achievers. So you would probably check the wording and probably modify them before using them again. When we're looking at the difficulty index, we are actually looking at the ratio of the number of students that can answer the exam question correctly divided by the total number of students who sit the exam. So this will usually range from 0 to 1, but in some programs you'll actually see it presented as a percentage. So if a difficulty index is less than 0.3, it means that the question was too hard. So that means that either the student didn't study that question, or lots of students didn't study that question, or that the topic wasn't adequately covered in your teaching. So you might have to think about removing this question or adjust your teaching for the next time that you do this topic. What we're looking for ideally is to have our difficulty index between 0.3 and 0.8, or between 30 and 80%. So that would be between 30 and 80% of students answering it correctly. So that would be deemed a moderate difficulty, and those are the questions that we want to accept and reuse if they have also a good discrimination ability. If they are above 0.8, that means that they are too easy. More than 80% of students are actually answering it correctly. So that means that we probably need to think about removing that question or adjusting the difficulty of that question if we use it in the future. So here's an example of an item analysis of a test that I gave in the mid-semester this year. So to get that, I go into the full grade center. I click on the drop down button that's on the right of the test name, and then I select item analysis. And what comes out is this summary up here and the questions down here. So it tells me that the mid-semester exam had 45 possible questions, 184 students completed it. The average score was 34.67 out of 45. So it's very high, and the average time students took to complete this exam was 37 minutes. Now Blackboard just spits out and categorizes up the top here our discrimination and difficulty index. So for this mid-semester exam, it said there were 23 good questions, 19 fair questions, and 3 poor questions. The difficulty index said there were 22 easy questions, 21 medium questions, and 2 hard questions. So if we go down to each of our questions that are just sitting at the bottom of our item analysis, we can see that 2 of them actually have a red or a pink dot next to them. So those are questions that Blackboard is asking you to go and review. Now, if we come and review those, we can see that the discrimination ability is quite low, 0.24 and 0.23, and the difficulty index is high. So it means that 94% of students got this question right, so it's not a very good question, and 88% of students got this one correct down here. So those are ones that I wouldn't be reusing again. Now, if we have a look at all of the questions, all 45 questions together, looking at how the students performed, we can see that that's really not a normal curve. It's very much skewed, and the mean is going to be very high for this particular example. So how would I adjust this in the future? So in the future, I would go and remove those items that had low discrimination ability, and I would also remove those who had a difficulty index that was below 0.3 or above 0.8. And hopefully by doing those adjustments, I would actually bring the next test down into a more normal distribution with a slightly lower mean. This is an example of the type of item analysis that you get out of ExamSoft. So again, this is another exam that I've run in the same unit. This is the end of semester exam, and we can see that the grade distribution actually looks quite normal. Okay, we've got the mean score at 64% and the median score at 65%. So just a very slight skewing. The high score was 99% and the low score was 27%. And the overall reliability of the exam was 0.93. So that is actually an excellent reliability score. So it means that this exam that I gave at the end of semester was highly reliable. So it did very well at actually testing the construct that I wanted to test. And we had a good discriminative index of 40 or 41, which means that there was a good ability to be able to discriminate or distinguish between the top performers and the low performers, and the difficulty index was sitting between 0.3 and 0.8 at 0.65, so that's good. So what we get out of ExamSoft looks like this, and to get that you're going to click on the reporting or adjusting scoring to get the graph, which is automatically made for you. In the previous example, I actually had to make the graph. You don't get that in Blackboard. And if you want to get the psychometrics with your point by serials and your difficulty index, you're going to have to click on the View Assessment tab, which is on the top left. So we don't get to see the actual question, we get to see the title of the question, and we can see the point by serial. And what's quite nice in ExamSoft is that the acceptable point by serials are coloured in green, and the unacceptable ones are coloured in red. So you can see that all of these questions to do with the basal nuclei all had a very nice point by serial. And the difficulty indexes also were quite good. This first one perhaps is a little bit harder, a little bit more easy because it has a higher difficulty index. And this one down here is more difficult because only 67 or 60% of students got this question right. So it is a very good discriminator of good or kind of top performing versus low performing students. So to summarize, to create a rigorous and reliable exam, you really need to think about your learning and your teaching and make sure that your content is aligned to your learning outcomes, that the types of questions that you ask or the format of the questions are aligned to the learning activities, that the level that you pitch them at on Bloom's taxonomy, make sure that's appropriate to the year level that your students are at. And when you're looking at your graphs of your distribution of results, you really want to see that mean, median, and mode being aligned for a normal distribution, and you would really like to see that somewhere between 60 and 80%. You'd like to see a discrimination index above 0.3, a difficulty index between 0.3 and 0.8, and a reliability coefficient above 0.8. So hopefully these tips have been helpful to you about how to create your own rigorous and reliable online exam. I'm Dr. Amanda Meyer. I'm an anatomist, an education researcher and lecturer at UWA. I'm also a council member of the Australian and New Zealand Association for Clinical Anatomists, editorial board member of Anatomical Sciences Education Journal, and you can find me on Twitter at Amanda Meyer PhD. And if you want to look at anything else that I research, you can find me on ORCID. Thanks for listening.